Well, thank you. And thank you all for being here. I first of all need to thank the sponsors of this tour. I'm here under the auspices of the German Foreign Office via the German consulate in Toronto. I'm also having my travel sponsored for this tour by BMW Canada, so thanks to both of them. Thanks to the folks here at McMaster for hosting me. Meine Damen und Herren, ich danke Ihnen allen für Ihr Kommen. And that's all the German I'm going to do this morning, so as not to offend the native German speakers in the room with my terrible accent. What I'm going to talk about today is tracking the German leap, this ambitious transition that Germany is making from an unsustainable to a sustainable industrial basis, predominantly in energy, but as I hope you'll see, it goes much beyond energy issues. To begin with, though, I thought I'd explain a little bit about the kind of core thesis of my book, The Leap, which doesn't just look at Germany. It looks more broadly worldwide at what this sustainability shift looks like, not just for national governments, but businesses, organizations, communities, even individuals. And really what the book is about is this necessary paradigm shift, genuine paradigm shift, not the sort of colloquial way it's used now, from an unsustainable to a sustainable track. Basically, the route we're on any number of measures has a very, very ugly trajectory as we get later into the century. I always like to give it just one piece of sort of sobering data or detail, just so that we're all clear. Of course, the biggest piece of this puzzle, the real motive for making this transition is climate change. And to give it one example, our current greenhouse gas emissions trajectory, because a quarter of all of our carbon dioxide gets absorbed back into the world's oceans where it's being turned into carbonic acid and upsetting the mechanism by which corals form reefs. So current emissions trajectory by most marine biologists and ocean chemists' estimates would more or less guarantee there are no healthy coral reefs left on Earth by the end of the century. You can talk to some experts who'll tell you that the sort of tipping point for that might be even closer. So among other things, our current trajectory, business as usual, means the end of coral reefs, more or less. And so that brings us to the kind of bottom line or key motivation for this transition. Paul Hawken is one of the world's pioneers of sustainable business and charting the sustainable economy. And a couple of years ago, he was speaking to a graduating class at the University of Portland and sort of set the parameters properly by saying, civilization needs a new operating system. You are the programmers, and we need it within a few decades. So pretty tall order, pretty massive transition. The critical thing to think about when you think about Hawkins' line, though, is he talks about a new operating system. He doesn't say a whole new computer. He doesn't say a whole new way of communicating. What he's referring to there is this sort of sustainability paradigm where the advanced technology, the incredibly elaborate democratic and technological processes that got us to this point of considerable prosperity, those we want to try and hang on to. What we're talking about is swapping out one operating system for another. Probably the easiest shorthand for that is that currently well over 80% of the world's energy, all of the world's primary energy, comes from fossil fuels. And by mid-century or so, we need to invert that. We need to be getting 80% or more of our primary energy from non-fossil sources, or at least non-emitting sources, by one means or another. And that's where Germany enters this conversation, because of all of the leading industrial countries, there's probably, in fact, there isn't a single one that has fully embraced that new paradigm, that primary motive, as Germany has. Germany has committed itself to something close to no greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. Certainly, they've committed themselves to 80% of their electricity coming from renewable sources. And this is something that when it was initially proposed seemed much more complicated and had a much bigger question mark over it than it does now. And part of the reason for that is that even just in its first decade of really serious activity, you can kind of trace this energy transition all the way back to the early 1990s, but really it kicked into high gear in 2000 with the passage of Germany's Renewable Energy Sources Act, which was a radical, very, very robust incentive for renewable energy. You travel in Germany today, and you see that effect on the landscape. Almost everywhere you look, you will see large-scale wind and solar. Germany's also made some huge advances in biomass power plants and a number of other renewable fuel sources. And it's done so, and this is something to keep in mind as we look at how Germany's energy transition has gone, despite the fact that the resource is not that great. It's not that Germany is particularly windy or particularly sunny. It's not blessed with a lot of open space or coastline or countryside, particularly compared to a country like Canada, and yet it finds itself in this lead position where, just to kind of put a number on it, there was a particularly sunny afternoon this spring where 40% of the entire country's electricity was coming just from solar panels. And that's the kind of stat that 10 years ago when I started researching and reporting this stuff would have seemed pretty far-fetched. That would have been well outside even some of the most optimistic estimates for where Germany was going. And for that reason, even though the current German government, Chancellor Angela Merkel's conservative government, initially opposed this energy transition, they've actually now given it its kind of colloquial name of the Energiewende, the energy transition, and recommitted Germany to this transformation. And what it describes, as I said, is basically a move from fossil fuels to low-carbon, renewable, distributed energy systems, and to a radical shift in energy efficiency. We all talk about doing this. This is certainly something in any climate change discussion comes up, that we know we need to be moving to renewable sources. But Germany is really one of the few countries that has demonstrated how that would actually look. And I think because it is so far out of step with some of the other major industrial countries, particularly Canada and the United States, there remains an enormous amount of skepticism and, in fact, quite a bit of misinformation about what is happening on the ground in Germany. What does this Energiewende look like, and where is it taking them? So I thought I'd begin, and these will be the only graphs and charts this morning, but I did think it would be helpful to begin with where they've gotten so far. So if you look at the change in energy use by source from 1990 to 2012 on Germany's grid, you see a 30% plus decline in nuclear. That was accelerated after the Fukushima disaster by the more rapid phase out of Germany's nuclear plants. Coal use overall is down 14%. There have been some interim shifts to that transition. You will hear, depending on what media sources you read about Germany, you'll hear numbers like, they will need 20 more coal plants, 29 more coal plants, 26 more coal plants. I've been hearing these numbers for 8-9 years now. In actual fact, there's basically a half dozen new coal plants being built in Germany, all of them to replace older, less efficient ones. So there is still a reliance on coal, but it's dropping. And of course, you can see the big story, which is a 614% increase in Germany's use of renewables. And this switch has generated some pretty remarkable figures for the German economy and for Germany's greenhouse gas profile. So since 1990, this is the change to their emissions and their economics. Overall energy use is down 11%. So there is a pretty massive efficiency effort being paired with this Energiewende. Carbon dioxide emissions overall down 26%. They continue to fall, though there was a little hiccup between 2011 and 2012, and you will see, if you are following this story, frequent assertions that this demonstrates that the Energiewende is failing. When in fact, if you look at what was happening 2011 to 2012, one was, of course, the accelerated phase out of nuclear plants. And then the second piece of that, which is almost never mentioned in most conventional media, is that it was an especially cold winter. It was particularly heavy heat use. As far as the German economy, which people have been or I've certainly been hearing, is imminently going to fail because of this Energiewende, is actually up 37% in real GDP since 1990. And probably the most impressive statistic when you think about it is this one. CO2 productivity. That's economic productivity of carbon consumption. This is a phrase that Amory Lovins of the Rocky Mountain Institute uses. I've actually on my website put up some links to some excellent work of Lovins kind of analyzing what's been happening in Germany. And what he's getting at there is that for every ton of emissions Germany still emits, it's getting 84% more productivity in its economy. So, we in Canada, for example, do a lot of talk about emissions intensity in our heavy industries, and Germany is actually leading in that category as well. Obviously, absolute emissions need to fall, but the fact that they are getting that much more value, so to speak, out of the carbon they still burn is an important detail. So let's tally that all up overall. Where has Germany gotten to? They began with about 3% of their electricity coming from renewables installed on the grid in 2000, and that was the year that the Renewable Energy Sources Act was passed. By the way, and I will come back to this, Ontario's Green Energy Act, which has been sort of a mixed bag, and we can talk about that later as well, was directly modeled on Germany's Renewable Energy Sources Act. This is the sort of pioneering feed-in tariff approach to renewable energy generation, and they're now up to 26%. The initial target was 12% by 2010. That was easily exceeded. Current target is 35% by 2020. All reports are that it will be easily exceeded, and then the ultimate goal, which is 80% by 2050, and there's nothing sort of suggesting that they will miss any of those targets. One of the other things that you would hear, certainly in some circles, is that electricity grids can't handle this much intermittent small-scale renewable energy generation, but in fact Germany has the most reliable grid in Europe, far more reliable than many of the grids in North America. Just by way of example, I was at an event the other night with a gentleman from a large-scale cement and aggregates company that works in Mississauga, and he told me, and this amazed me, that last year they had 47 power failures at their plant in Mississauga. So Germany has moved to 26% renewable energy and actually increased the reliability of its grid. One of my favorite little bits of statistic that I think gives you a sense of the scale and speed of Germany's energy transition is this one about solar power. In 2005, on the entire planet, there was 6,000 megawatts of solar energy installed. Last year, Germany added 8,000 megawatts to its grid. So an entire 2005 planet's worth of solar being added every single year to Germany's grid, along with other renewable sources. And this is a scale and a pace of transition that really not even the authors of the Renewable Energy Act thought they would see this quickly. And it's demonstrating, I think, that this technology is closer to ready to be a primary energy source than a lot of people thought. This is sort of how it breaks down for the German economy. 382,000 jobs created in the renewable energy sector since 1990. More than 250,000 of those just since the passage of the Renewable Energy Sources Act. So it's been a huge job creation engine. Germany now generates $55 billion a year in economic activity from its renewable energy industry. Both of these numbers beginning to match the scale of the auto industry in Germany. And of course, I'm here partly under the auspices of BMW. This is a very robust auto industry, and Germany's renewable energy industry is beginning to be almost as important to its economy. The average cost to a German household, presuming that household has not gotten involved in energy production, is about $250 a year. That is increasing, and that's been where some of the negative press on the Energiewende has come from, is from these escalating electricity prices, but there's actually several causes of that. It's not just renewable energy, and it is being dealt with. And by the way, maybe the most important stat, because you do, particularly going into this German election this fall, I saw, The Economist, several British daily newspapers, Der Spiegel even, Germany's own national magazine, talking about how disastrous the Energiewende had been for the country in general, hundreds of thousands of people allegedly now in energy poverty, the rest of it. And yet, despite all that, 93% of Germans say they are in favor of continuing and, in fact, expanding the transition to renewable energy. That's an extraordinarily high popularity rate. That's as close as you get in a democratic country to universal agreement on a subject. And in fact, in that fall election, the conservative government's junior partner, the smaller party that formed the former German government, the Free Democrats, the FDP, they were the only party advocating a repeal of the Renewable Energy Sources Act, and they have fallen out of the Bundestag entirely. There's a 5% threshold of minimum support before you can have seats in parliament in Germany, and they fell below that 5% support and are essentially wiped out of government. And they were the only ones advocating for a serious shift in Germany's Energiewende. So what does it look like on the ground today? Well, it's a very, very popular, very grassroots-driven transition. One of the things that I will come back to repeatedly this morning is how important that community buy-in, that opportunity for hundreds of thousands, millions, in fact, of German individuals, German households to get involved in energy production has led to widespread support for this transition. And in fact, it's really being pushed from below. A lot of the conventional power suppliers, as you can imagine, not terribly fond of the Energiewende. It was a challenge to their business. This is being treated sometimes in the business press as a problem or a failure of this transition, when in fact the authors of the initial act intended exactly this, that they would build a new industrial and power generating basis that would challenge the authority of the existing conventional power industry. And in fact, RWE, which is one of the largest power producers in Germany, one of the big old coal and conventional energy producers, just announced last week that they are basically abandoning any new activity in the conventional energy sector and have now moved their entire business focus into the renewable sector. Again, this was treated in the business press as some sort of problem and not a direct and intentional result of the act itself. So that's where Germany's gotten to in this first phase of its Energiewende. One of the things that's happened is that it's not just about installing solar panels and building wind turbines. It is in fact building that new industrial basis, and that's part of the reason why you see such widespread support. It's not just tree huggers and entrepreneurs in the solar industry who are seeing new industrial activity. There are also facilities like this. One of the things that Germany has done in the sort of second phase now emerging is a pretty big commitment to offshore wind power. And so this is the scale of offshore wind production on the port at Bremerhaven. Bremerhaven was a declining port until a few years ago when the offshore wind industry amped up, and now you see this huge new industrial activity, the scale of which is pretty amazing. What you're looking at right there is actually the midsections of offshore wind turbines. The facility, this enormous warehouse in behind, run by a company called Weserwind, makes the bases. And I wasn't allowed to take pictures inside, but I can tell you when you're inside, it's a serial production facility, the first in the world for industrial wind turbine bases. And these are just extraordinarily huge steel tripods. It looks like sort of Eiffel Towers being made in a Henry Ford assembly line kind of format. All that to add something like 8,000 megawatts of wind energy in the next 7 or 8 years. Again, wind was thought, or offshore wind especially, was thought to maybe play a bigger role, but what's happened is other parts of the transition, including the solar economy, have boomed so quickly that the wind piece isn't as important. One of the reasons I point this out, though, is because Weserwind, the company that's doing all of this, is not some upstart renewable energy company. It's actually a subdivision of one of Germany's oldest steel makers, 150-year-old steel maker, now seeing lots of new economic activity generated by the making of wind turbine components. And that gets to why there is such popular support for the Energiewende, because it is actually providing a growing economic sector. It's sort of we tended to rely in previous generations on other aspects of heavy industry, automaking or resource extraction. We still rely a lot on that here in Canada. Germany's seeing similar kinds of support and therefore political power emerging from this new energy sector. Probably the most important factor, though, in why this is such a popular transition in Germany is that it has made enormous differences in the everyday lives of Germans. Not just because they get to say their greenhouse gas emissions are dropping and there are new jobs, but also because really for the first time almost ever, I mean really you go back to Paleolithic times, the relationship between human beings and energy has been you leave your domicile, you leave your place of residence, go find energy, bring it back, use it up, deal with whatever mess it makes, and then go find more. We now have the opportunity to live in dwellings that function as power plants, and this is sort of the flagship of that model. This is a community in Freiburg in southern Germany, in the sunniest part of the country. These are 58 modern townhomes, all modern conveniences, more or less the same price as any other similar kind of residence in this part of Germany. Every single one of these, over the course of a year, makes more power than it uses. These are houses functioning, all of them, as power plants. And the reason for that is not just because of all that all those solar panels on the roof. It's also because the architect working under this new paradigm said, from the ground up, we are now going to build houses to function as power plants. And when that's now your sort of design brief, you get very, very zealous about using every bit of energy you can, about trapping the passive solar heat and light from the sun and conserving all the energy you can to get to the point where your energy demand has gone down so low that the solar panels on the roof can provide more than your needs. And this was one of those things, not in the Leap, but the previous book, The Geography of Hope. I was doing research for that in 2006 in this part of Germany, and met with the architect and saw the community and came back and dutifully reported it. And then I would be speaking to audiences here in Canada, whether they be business audiences or academic audiences, and inevitably someone would come up afterward and say, is that really the case? Is it literally more power than they need, or is that just under ideal conditions if it was a really sunny year? What's the black and white of that? And so the next time I went back, just a few years ago, I had a gander at somebody's power bills. This is one of the couples that lives in the community. These power bills attest to the fact unequivocally that they made more power than they needed over the course of 2008. As a matter of fact, so much more. And because there is such a generous incentive to sell energy back to the grid from renewable sources, they were actually looking at about a $5,000 profit that year. So overall, their energy budget was profit-making, not costing them anything. That was going to offset the cost of the panels themselves. And they were nearing, so this was a few years ago, I believe they said they thought about 2012, 2013, they would hit the point where the added cost to the house would be paid off by the profit from the power plant, and that they would now be looking at another 15, maybe 20 years of life left in those panels, just generating a profit year after year, simply for living in the right kind of house. And this is the kind of thing that when I first got a look at it, and once you're inside one of these houses and you can kind of do the household equivalent of kicking the tires and realizing that it's for real, you think, why are we building anything else? If this is now technologically possible, economically feasible, why are we building conventional energy wasting, non-energy producing dwellings? Part of the reason, of course, is because we don't have that Energiewende, not just the Renewable Energy Sources Act, but the whole sort of array of incentives and rewards for making the transition. In any case, this is an enormous part of why Germans have been so enthusiastic about the energy transition, because it isn't just about having a different power source. Ultimately, day to day, do you really care that much about what's making the lights stay on and keeping this building warm? Not really, unless you can own a piece of it. And so how did they get to this point? And how is it different, by the way, from the way the Green Energy Act is rolled out in Ontario? Let's go back, and I think you'll see from the very first a critical difference in Germany's energy transition from what's happened, for example, here in Ontario, is that it was people-driven from the very first. It emerged actually from a very unique coalition of protest in southern Germany in the 1970s. Basically, there was a proposal in 1974 to build a nuclear power plant, basically on the edge of the Black Forest in southern Germany. And not just environmentalists and those sort of usual activist subjects, but also farmers, vineyard owners, all of the people who lived off the land in this part of Germany joined together, occupied the land, said this is unacceptable, this is not the direction that we want Germany to go in. And out of that first protest emerged probably the world's most robust anti-nuclear movement. It grew and eventually took over the country to the point where new activity in the nuclear sector was near impossible to do in Germany. And it also gave rise to the modern Green movement. The first Green parties emerged out of those early anti-nuclear protests in Germany. The Green Party in Germany is easily the strongest in the world, not only a major player at the federal level, but also controlling state and local governments in some areas. Very, very robust Green movement in Germany. And this was, in fact, what led directly to the Renewable Energy Sources Act. It began with Hans-Josef Fell and a few others. Fell was a village councillor elected to the council of his village in Hammelburg in Bavaria in the early 1990s. The conversation about climate change had just begun. Fell thought, why doesn't our village become kind of a pioneer of this transition we know we're going to have to make? So they passed a feed-in tariff at the village scale, and that feed-in tariff eventually moved on to larger jurisdictions, larger cities, and then all the way to the federal government. Didn't happen overnight. One of the things that happened was between that first feed-in tariff in the early 90s and 1998, Hans-Josef Fell got involved in federal politics as a Green Party candidate, was elected to government in 1998. 1998 was a very big transition for the German government to the Red-Green coalition. The SPD, the conventional left-wing party, and the Greens formed the government in 98. And that was where Fell got to working with Hermann Scheer from the SPD on the national energy policy that has created all of this transformation. Scheer is worth dwelling on a little bit, his strategy, his way of thinking about how it is that we get to that low carbon economy. Scheer, long-time left-wing MP, long-time left-wing activist, was engaging in the late 1980s with the environmental movement in Germany that had emerged out of the anti-nuclear movement, and saw the problem of climate change immediately as a question of energy, not a question of emissions, but how we make the energy. The way he would put it is that the climate change debate was inevitably going to move to questions of who makes energy, how, and where, and profits from it. And Scheer was unique in seeing that it was not simply enough to say we don't want what we currently have. And what he would say to the activists in his constituency is, I get it, I understand that we need to make some big changes. What is the non-fossil fuel alternative to nuclear? You've soundly rejected nuclear. What do we do instead? And in the early 1990s, there was not an answer for that. But Scheer began thinking it through and figuring out how that transition would play. And one of the most radical things probably about his political career was that he was the only member of any party in the German Bundestag in the 90s to vote against ratifying the Kyoto Accord. And when I asked him about that a few years ago, he said, the problem with the whole Kyoto process is that it basically sets up this entire international conversation about climate change as one of costs and burdens. He called that whole process the burden-sharing bazaar. It would inevitably turn into a debating society for the world's energy bureaucracies about who was dirtiest and who was worst and who should change most and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, I think Scheer's read on that wound up being quite accurate. There's not been a lot of success to point at from that process in recent years, certainly. And so what Scheer proposed instead was we need to come up with a way to build an industrial basis for this country that is as politically and economically powerful as the conventional energy industry. That's the only way we are going to get to where we need to get. And so Scheer immediately set to work on building that new industrial basis. And one of the first things he did, one of the things that did not, for example, happen here in Ontario, even before they passed the Renewable Energy Sources Act, one of the first things the Red-Green Coalition did was pass a piece of legislation called the 100,000 Solar Roofs Program. And to the energy bureaucracy at the time, 100,000 solar roofs was not a big deal. Sure, that's going to cause some tiny little blip on our overall energy picture, but not terribly expensive. And so go right ahead, start putting solar panels on roofs in sunny German villages. And what Scheer recognized, though, is that 100,000 solar roofs is 100,000 German households directly invested in this new economy. Not only that, he recognized that the appeal of renewable energy, particularly solar power, and being involved in your own power generation would be as behavioral economists like to call a sticky concept. Neighbors were going to want one. For every one of these arrays, there were 5 people up the block who were going to want their own. And so what he was doing, even before they passed the Renewable Energy Sources Act, was making it a popular movement, making it a grassroots social movement, and not just a question of energy bureaucracy. And that turned out to be enormously powerful for building popular support once they passed the Renewable Energy Sources Act. One of the other things that happened right away was that with the passage of the EG in 2000 and its expansion in 2004, not just energy sources changed, but this enormous new industrial sector emerged. At its peak, this is Solar Valley, just outside of Berlin, where the German solar industry set up. At its peak, about 4 or 5 years ago, German solar companies were occupying almost all of the top 10 spots on the Tech DAX, the stock index for technical companies in Germany. Huge transformation of this part of the countryside, not just in terms of how energy is made, but this is also the former East Germany. This was one of the first big shifts in unemployment and other social problems in that part of Germany since reunification. Another one of those things we often forget. Tomorrow is actually the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when Germany began this transition, it was still absorbing that failed economy. Not just in terms of the people and the rest of it, but the cost of shuttering. I mean, what you're looking at, Solar Valley, as it was called, just outside of Berlin. If you could expand the picture just a little bit, you would see just over that way the skeleton, the ruins of the East German chemical economy. Basically, during the Soviet bloc era, the vast majority of chemical film, photographic film, that sort of thing, was manufactured in this part of Germany, and all of those factories were obsolete the moment the wall fell. And so in addition to what it's meant for energy and the climate, it's also been a job creation engine, a source of hope and pride for regions of the country that haven't previously had it. One of the interesting things about Solar Valley, incidentally, is it's not even a particularly sunny part of Germany. Saxony is not known for its sun, so it was always quite ironic that the world's solar industry industrialized, basically moved from cottage industry to mainstream industry in this cloudy part of northeastern Germany. In any case, it has led to a pretty radical shift, not just in how energy is made, but also how it's used. And this was one of those things that Hermann Scheer liked to talk about. He called it the technologic of energy production, technologic, I guess, in German. And what Scheer meant by that was that one energy source is not the same as the other. 5 megawatts of renewable energy is not the same as 5 or 500 of coal power. And the reason for that, if you think about it, is that the fossil industries and the nuclear industry as well are based on scarce resources, unevenly distributed all over the world, difficult to get at, difficult to transform into usable fuel. And so from a business or an economic point of view, all of the value proposition in the conventional resource energy economy is in getting those resources and bringing them to market. That is where all the innovation happens. That is where most of the profit is made. Whereas the technologic of renewable energy is fundamentally different. Among other things, it strongly encourages small-scale distributed energy production. It strongly encourages efficiency, and it's entirely based on technological innovation to capture a free and limitless resource. So the resource is everywhere. It can be captured anywhere that you put your mind to it, and you are not going to be investing in fueling your power plants. You'll be investing in making them more efficient and work better. And so because of that and some other stuff that's going on in this energy transition, Germany is also a world leader in any number of efficiency measures, and you can see them in any number of German buildings. This is the new headquarters for Unilever in Europe. It's on the harbor front in Hamburg. And interesting building for a number of reasons. It is extraordinarily efficient, something like 80% more efficient than a typical German building. Marvel in terms of materials use and management of energy and the rest of it. But the most interesting thing about it is it was not built to be the greenest headquarters in Europe. It wasn't that Unilever said we want this to be sort of a flagship of our commitment to sustainability or anything like that. What they said to the designers and the architects and the builders was, we have a human resource problem in our company. We're currently headquartered in this office tower in downtown Hamburg. If you work on the 12th floor, you might never see your colleagues on the 15th floor unless you call a meeting, which is a kind of a cumbersome and inefficient way to solve problems. Can you give us a building where people will run into each other, where they'll interact socially and informally? And so in maximizing for energy efficiency and the rest of it, they also built one of the friendliest buildings I've ever been in to work in. As the architect who led me on the tour of this building put it, he said, we treat these as office buildings and we think of them in these little cookie cutter sort of ways, but really this is a living space for working in. You spend 8-10 hours a day in this building. It needs to be a great place to live in. So what's happening here, this is the central atrium that was designed basically to give that space for collaboration so that people would informally bump into each other. It's also a fantastic use of passive solar power, artificial or natural light. That enormous loop you're looking at there is not actually a lamp of any sort. It's actually a reflector pushing natural light into every corner of the building. And yes, this means they use a lot less energy in the building, but it also means that people are working in natural light more than in artificial light. And so, as we found, study after study, people are more productive when they're in natural light. They get sick less and stay sick for shorter duration. So sick days and that sort of thing have gone down since Unilever's moved into this building. And then, of course, the original design goal, which is that informal, casual collaboration, is happening all over the place because it's such a welcoming space. And this looks, by the way, like one of those staged architectural photos, I realize. It looks like, can we get some people informally collaborating for this picture? And then it'll look really good in the brochure. But I actually took the picture. And I was being led through on a tour with a number of other journalists at about 4 o'clock on a pretty gloomy April afternoon. And, 4 o'clock on a gloomy day, I think in a lot of businesses, people are starting to watch the clock or play Angry Birds and wait for the inevitable moment of release. Instead, as you can see, people lingering, hanging out, doing all that informal collaboration that was the initial goal of the entire thing. So getting at the fact that we're talking about a transition that has not only improved efficiency and energy production, but actually genuinely improved quality of life in the places where it's being most robustly invested in. This is just another example of the kind of design revolution that the energy transition has ignited. This is a new design school in Essen. For those of you who know your German geography, you know Essen is the absolute center point of Germany's old industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley. My father actually was a pilot in the Canadian Air Force and flew in Germany in the 1960s. And when I told him I was going to the Ruhr, his response was quite something. He said what he remembered was it did not matter what the weather forecasts were that day. When you flew over the Ruhr, it was cloudy. Inevitably, it was just this giant cloud of pollution from heavy industry. This is actually the remains of a former coal mine and coal plant, and the building, this new design school. The architecture firm that was brought in to do that, kind of already was a big sustainability booster and really committed themselves to this idea of energy transition. And one of the first things they did was look at what resources do we have here before we think about how it's going to connect to some grid. What can we optimize here first? And so, among other things, this sort of funky window design is not just an artistic or an aesthetic piece of the puzzle. It's actually maximizing interior light and passive solar gain throughout the year. The other thing that they realized was that they were sitting on an abandoned coal mine. And the old coal seams were being water was being constantly pumped out of them 24 hours a day so that they didn't get inundated and cause the entire site to collapse. And that water was coming out of the ground at 28 degrees or so Celsius. And that was an energy source. And that became the entire heating and cooling source for the building. Rather than doing conventional build a furnace and then try and insulate it sort of stuff, instead, every floor is full of this spaghetti of water tubes that are using heat transfer technology to both heat and cool the building as needed throughout the year. So this is a good-sized modern academic building that has no artificial heating or cooling source. It's entirely naturally heated and cooled. So that's the kind of stuff you see in terms of building design. Urban design is another area where Germans are now vaulting into the lead. This is a great example of that. This is the neighborhood of Vauban on the outskirts of Freiburg in southern Germany. This was a derelict French military base at the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is now arguably the greenest suburb anyone's ever built. Every single resident of this community was named a Time Hero of the Environment in 2009. Time focused on one particular aspect of the heroic life being lived in Vauban, which was that they had decided as a community to forego car ownership for the most part. And decided also that all the streets in the community, other than this main drag, would be free of cars. So there's a large parking lot at the edge of the community if you want to own a car. And then all of the open space inside is now given over to other sorts of activities. And one of the interesting things about it is how Vauban was designed. It was not master planned. In fact, what they did, they had all this open space. They refurbished a handful of the old French barracks and tore everything else down. And then they allowed the new homeowners to form these Baugruppen, building groups. And the building groups got together in groups of 6, 8, 10, 12, and decided, one, how they would meet the neighborhood's efficiency goals. Every single building in the community uses 80% or less of the German norm, and that was a design imperative for the community. But they all decided to do it in different ways. And they also all decided to do different things with their public space. So when you go through Vauban, it feels very much like a community that's always been there, because there's all these great little details. In one space there's a playground. In another open space there's a community brick oven for baking bread. They put all the elements you need of a community all in the same spot so that people didn't need their cars. And that's why in the end they decided, hey, let's not even put parking spots in among the places we're going to live. It wasn't a master plan. It wasn't from the minute, from the word go, they didn't say, hey, let's build a car-free community. What they said was, let's build, a sustainable, livable community, and they decided that cars were not the best part of that. This is also happening top-down, though. This is Hafen City in Hamburg, very close, actually, to that Unilever headquarters, huge redevelopment. one of the biggest and most ambitious I've ever seen of a derelict industrial site, in this case a piece of the old port in Hamburg. Hamburg's one of the world's premier ports, but an enormous chunk of it is no longer deep enough for modern supertankers and modern freight boat ships. So they've now redeveloped it. A number of things going on here. Hyper energy efficiency through all these buildings. Every single building in the community of Hafen City is required to be mixed use. So there is not a single purpose building in the entire community. They all do more than one thing. That really impressive thing up at in the background there is the not yet completed new opera house for Hamburg. And it is not just an opera house, it is also going to contain a hotel and offices. So it's basically an opera house sitting on top of a mixed-use office building. What this means, of course, is when you live in a community like this, you can meet most of your daily needs without having to rely on an automobile or anything else. And this is the kind of stuff that I think is emerging in part because when you start thinking about how you make energy as thoroughly as Germany has, you also start to really rethink how you use it. And so that's one piece of the puzzle. The other big thing, and I think one of the greatest lessons for Ontario, is the importance of community scale and community control in the German transition. This is a great example of this. This is the new power plant that was built for the village of Feldheim in eastern Germany. Feldheim's a rural agricultural community, not known for its radical embrace of new ideas, but they decided, because of the opportunities presented by the energy transition, that they would rather be self-sufficient for energy than relying on outside sources. So they built a biogas plant and a few wind turbines, and just like that, they were 100% renewable at a single go. Similar sorts of things happening in German villages across the countryside. This is the village of Oberosfa in Hesse. If you know Germany, Hesse is the place that the rest of Germany makes fun of for being, hyper-conservative, completely set in its ways, the last place you would expect to see radical thinking. But in this case, the village decided, not for climate change or reasons or anything like that, but basically because of a sort of resentment of reliance on foreign fuel sources, and in particular relying on Russia for natural gas is a bit of a sore point for a lot of Germans, and for reasons that if you're a student of history you would be well familiar with. In any case, this is a 850 person village, and they were tearing, it's now complete, they were tearing up the roads to build a district heating system for the entire village as part of their move away from foreign sources. And there was a great, when this was being built, the Wall Street Journal did a story on it, and one of the guys who led the project was a 72-year-old retiree named Hans Bertram. And the quote that he gave the Wall Street Journal was, "We don't want to be getting 3,000 liters of oil off some ship from Saudi Arabia. This way the money stays here in the community." So very much a self-reliance and a self-sufficiency argument and an energy security argument, not one of climate change and sustainability necessarily as its primary goal. So that is that is the first phase of the Energiewende. That's where Germany's gotten to date. Where do they go next? This is an area of much debate and much skepticism, but everything I've seen, and certainly everything the German government has said, is that the initial trajectory remains the one that they are committed to, which is that 80% renewable source grid by 2050. The thick green piece is the growing chunk of renewable energy on the grid. These are not wishful kind of goals. There's been a lot of planning and engineering and serious thinking around these goals. So one of the things I've noticed is if you're reading a story about where Germany is right now, and that story tends to have sort of a skeptical eye or suggest that there is calamity or difficulty that they can't think their way through, it will never mention the actual targets and the prospectus for hitting them. The reason for that is because no one in German government has said that they are wavering from this commitment, and no one has said they can't do it. They are, however, running into certain kind of management issues that basically emerge from the fact that the grids in most countries, Germany included, are built to have these huge nodes and big centralized power plants. And there's a certain way you manage that kind of power plant that doesn't necessarily work that well with a lot of renewable energy generation. And this is where a lot of the speculation that Germany would have to back off of this because the grid can't be upgraded, you can't manage a modern industrial country where the majority of the energy comes from renewables, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, if you look at the leading jurisdictions where this is happening, they are thinking through those problems. They are complex. There's a lot of technological and engineering thought going into solving them, but they are in fact solvable. And actually the best example of this, we need to leave Germany for a moment and go just north into Denmark to see the next generation of the smart grid. And the great thing about this is not just that the Danes are figuring out how to manage a renewable energy economy, but they are also creating what I think is the single most enticing value proposition to yet emerge from this energy transition. So let's kind of walk through it. To begin with, more than 25% of Danish energy comes from wind. And only wind. So they've just got the one renewable source. They've got a little bit of solar, but the Danes do wind in a big way. And the Danish goal is for 50% of their grid to be wind powered by about 2025. And so that's pretty ambitious and a pretty near-term target. And so when the Danish government created that mission and launched that goal, what they immediately ran into was a question of grid management. Currently, the way they manage their wind power is by load sharing with other Scandinavian countries that have a lot of hydro and in some cases nuclear. And you can do that and you can kind of manage the intermittency of the wind. But they recognize that 50% we're not going to be able to manage it that way. We need to rethink how we build a grid. We need to basically build a whole other kind of grid, a smart grid for 21st century renewable energy technology. And so they set the best minds to work doing that. Among those best minds was the Danish Technical University and the Danish Energy Agency, but very quickly a couple of very large companies got involved. IBM and Siemens are two of the leads on this. Siemens, of course, the huge German electricity and manufacturing company. And so they chose eventually the island of Bornholm, which is what you're looking at right now. Bornholm is a very small touristy and agricultural island off the coast of Sweden, has this sort of almost storybook kind of place in Danish culture. It's the most Danish of Dane places in the sense it's the way a friend of mine in Copenhagen put it. People think that the Bornholm accent is like just the most charming of Danish accents. It's got this real place in Danish hearts. It's also getting 45% of its energy from the wind, so it made a really good test bed for this next generation smart grid. And as they mapped it out, what they discovered was not only was it not impossible, but there was a huge opportunity here to not just rethink how we make energy, but how we live our daily lives. And so this is, in a sense, the value proposition of the Danish EcoGrid project. It begins with wind power. Wind power is intermittent. It blows at different times from when we need power. So they knew that storage was going to be an enormous piece of this puzzle. They looked at currently available storage technology and realized the most affordable and cost-effective was to assume that by 2025 there would be a significant number of electric vehicles on the road. And so that would become one of the ways you manage the grid. And so the way this would work, in 2025 as a Danish homeowner is, you'd plug your car in at night. Wind blows strong overnight, but demand's really low, so you'd be buying energy on the cheap. One of the things they've already done is create real-time pricing on the grid in Bornholm for 1,900 households at 5-minute increments. And so what that means is your household appliances, anything connected to the smart grid, can decide basically every 5 minutes whether it's worth continuing to draw power or not. Because a lot of the stuff that's the big energy use in a house doesn't have to happen in a particularly timely fashion. You think about a refrigerator, you don't really care when it does its cooling. You just want what's inside to stay within an acceptable range of cool. And so if your refrigerator is about to kick in and make a huge demand for power, and it checks the spot price of electricity and realizes, one, that it is high, and two, that it is likely to fall in the next hour or so, you can delay that, and not only does that allow you to save money, but it helps with grid management as well. In any case, so you plug the car in at night, fuel up on the cheap, drive to your place of work, plug it back in to the grid, and now you've got a little sort of power brokerage in your car waiting for prices to rise to a point where it's worth starting to sell the power you've stored back to the grid. And you can imagine this at sort of a smartphone app level where you would maybe say, you've got to know your electric vehicle really well. You know you need 50 or 60% of the fuel to get you where you want to go for the rest of the day. Anything above that, just start selling it back to the grid. So now not only are you buying power cheap, you're selling it back at a profit. You're an energy broker as well as a consumer. This is not, by the way, entirely future tense. If you look on the ground in Bornholm, all of the pieces are in place, although there are not enough electric vehicles yet. So they could only do sort of a test bed version of the electric vehicle piece, but all the other smart grid components have been put in place. This is a cluster of the different technologies that both IBM and Siemens are playing with in terms of how to manage at a household scale the smart grid. The really key part, you can see just there, is a plug that allows you to connect your appliances to the internet and be able to talk to the grid manager about what's happening with prices. But this is, 12 years off what mainstream energy production in Northern Europe, I think, may very well look like. So you could potentially live in a house that makes more power than it produces. You're using that house to fuel up on the cheap, and you've massively reduced your energy costs because all of your big heavy load appliances and other energy users are actually making decisions for you rather than simply drawing energy whenever you think it might be needed. And that, to my mind, is not just a way to get off of fossil fuel, but at every turn a better solution to the current situation. And I think that's where we're starting to see some really big shifts. I should point out, by the way, that is an actual production model BMW car, the BMW i3, which is their all-electric vehicle that's coming out in a couple of years. The reason I point out the car, too, is to point out that, it might look a little futuristic at this point. 2025 is 12 years off, and that's when the Danes hope to be implementing this, or having begun implementing this anyway, nationwide. And 12 years ago, roughly, was when I first started as a journalist to look at this sort of clean tech revolution that was emerging. And the reason I got into it was because I went, at the time I was working for Time magazine, and I went to an electric vehicle show in Montreal. The International Electric Vehicle Show that year happened to be in Montreal. And basically all the big car companies had all their concept cars there. There was a version of what became the Toyota Prius, a version of what became the Nissan Leaf. Ford had a hydrogen-powered car, the only waste product of which was clean water. That was pretty amazing. But at the time, certainly nobody thought BMW would be a major player in it. The other electric car I could show you would be the Tesla Model S, which some of you may be familiar with. Certainly nobody 12 years ago said, what's going to happen is some dot-com billionaire is going to decide to build a car company from scratch and build the world's most advanced electric vehicle that outperforms conventional automobiles by 2013. And yet that, of course, is exactly what happened. So I think if we look at where we are now, and you can actually see all the pieces on the ground of where the Danes and companies like Siemens want to go, you begin to, I think, see a pretty optimistic picture of where this energy transition is taking us. In fact, so optimistic that Siemens, for its part, has more or less bet the company on it. Siemens is not as well known in Canada. In Europe, Siemens makes damn near everything. Siemens makes trains. Siemens makes enormous power stations, components and load sharing equipment. They make a lot of hospital appliances as well, hospital machinery. And what they've basically done in the last couple of years is commit to being the kind of urban sustainability solution company for the world. And so to announce this to the world, this is the Siemens Crystal on the Thames in London, in the Docklands near Canary Wharf. And it's basically an enormous permanent trade show for Siemens' next generation technology. I was just recently there in September for the C40 City Climate Awards. So, big cities around the world giving each other awards for leadership in sustainability, energy reduction, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, that sort of thing. It's a Siemens building they meet in, and we were, shown a whole pile of very interesting Siemens technology inside, and really just gives you a kind of taste of the kind of stuff Siemens is getting into. What they look at is, regardless of how we make the power, although we expect it to increasingly come from renewable sources, a lot of that sort of big picture solution stuff is going to happen at the urban scale. We're now more than half of us, as has become increasingly well known, more than half of us now live in cities. By 2050, when we know we need to be living in a low carbon economy, 80% of the world will be living in cities. So we will have to solve this at city scale, and that's what Siemens is aiming to do, not just by developing smart grids, but by basically building the whole electric-powered infrastructure of the 21st century. And some pretty amazing stuff going on there. By the way, this thing here, I didn't get a chance to play with it as much as I would have liked. That's basically a sort of really elaborate SimCity kind of city model thing that when they bring in big city planners, they can play around with to figure out what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. It was like the best kind of urban design geek video game I'd ever seen. In any case, that is the prospect for the German energy transition, not only to lead the world to a low-carbon economy, but also to develop the tools and technologies that will help the rest of us get there. And the obvious question is, what does this mean for Canada, and particularly for Ontario's Green Energy Act? I think we should begin by acknowledging that we have far superior resources to begin with as we make this energy transition. This is what Canada's solar map looks like. You can see the comparative German map over there. There's almost nowhere in Germany with solar resources as good as Southern Ontario's, nowhere near the solar resource that we have in my hometown of Calgary, which gets the same amount of sun every year as Rio de Janeiro, almost. And so really, from a resource perspective, it shouldn't be Germany that's adding 8,000 megawatts a year. Surely we have more than enough space and more than enough sun to be doing the same in Canada. Part of the reason, to my mind, we're not seeing quite the scale of transition under the Ontario Green Energy Act is because the Ontario Green Energy Act, in its first phase anyway, really made it much easier to do large-scale, industrial-scale wind development by sort of top-down corporate entities than allowing Ontario homeowners to get solar panels put on the roof. Not that nobody has, and you might know folks here in Ontario who have, but it is easily the most complicated, unnecessarily bureaucratic piece of the whole Green Energy Act is you as a household owner or individual getting into the energy business. Whereas in Germany, for example, more than 50% of all the renewable energy installations in the country are owned by either individuals or small cooperatives or small municipalities. And that sort of points out that the opportunity is here and that it's actually a kind of a people and a bureaucratic problem that we have in Ontario. And actually you can see the best case of that, that I know of anyway, in Sault Ste. Marie. Everyone knows, of course, Sault Ste. Marie, long known for its radical energy experiments. But in any case, Sault Ste. Marie has in fact started to rebrand itself the alternative energy capital of North America. They are doing some of the largest scale solar development in all of Ontario, also some very, very large scale wind development, of course. And in addition to that, waste to energy, biodiesel, landfill methane, basically taking all of the resources in their region and seeing just how far they can get down the same path Germany's gone on. And so then the question becomes, why the Sioux, of all places, is this happening? Is it that the Sioux has the best resources? Definitely not. Is it that they began from a point where they had a lot more of that sort of activity already happening when the Green Energy Act was passed? No. And so the only reasonable explanation is that the one thing that differentiates Sault Ste. Marie from almost every other municipality in Ontario is that it controls its own grid. As a sort of, it was grandfathered in when Ontario Hydro came onto the scene, a century ago. Sault Ste. Marie already had a municipally controlled grid, and that has allowed them to manage their own energy future rather than relying on the provincial bureaucracy, which has proven less than hugely enthusiastic about some of this stuff, to put it mildly. And of course, what it demonstrates as well is whatever your community is, wherever you are, this idea of taking control of your own energy future is an incredibly enticing one to communities, whether they speak German or not. And is in fact demonstrating, I think, every single place that it's being attempted, that it is pointing to much brighter future in a whole bunch of ways. That's not to downplay the challenges, and I'm going to move to questions in a moment, and you can ask me about some of the challenges, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about your own experiences with this. Some of you may be involved in this or know people who are. I'm also letting you know my website, the LeapWorks.com. currently has a handful of links. If you click on the Energiewende poster that's on the main page, you'll find links to Chapter 3 of the book, The Leap, which is the one that focuses on Germany. You'll also find links to some of the documents I used for the statistics and also a piece I wrote for the Walrus about Europe's move to sustainability across the board. I welcome you to have a look. I welcome you to get in touch. I have my card with me if you'd like to get in touch individually later. But for as long as you want to stick around, I think we have the room for at least another half hour. Let's talk. I'm happy to take your questions, and thanks for your time. So, questions, comments? Questions, comments?
We don't have the capacity to meet energy needs short term without going.
All right.
What's your reaction?
I believe that James Hansen is a fantastic climate scientist and a fantastic leader in that field, and I firmly believe James Hansen does not know the energy sector well enough to be making those sorts of comments, and not to be dismissive of it. This is a recurring theme. It's a thing that there are now. The Breakthrough Institute in the United States is big on nuclear. Lots of people saying renewables can't get us there fast enough. It's an interesting thing because if you broke ground tomorrow, and you couldn't do that in any jurisdiction on Earth, there's not a jurisdiction on Earth where you could decide to start a nuclear plant tomorrow. You'd be looking at 10, maybe 15 years before it generates a single megawatt of power. Not only that, you would be using technology that has had 40 years of subsidy to be market competitive and is already being outperformed at a cost per watt installed by some of the renewables. So before we even get into the waste issue, in my experience, it's predominantly North American and to a lesser degree British commentators who are saying renewables can't get us there. And I don't know if it's a translation problem, but they simply don't seem to talk very often to their counterparts in Germany, Denmark, Portugal, Spain, China, for that matter, which has gotten into renewables in a big way about where the future goes. I mean, I think China is actually not a bad example. The Chinese are very, very ecumenical, I guess you could say, when it comes to power production. They're doing all of it all the time, everywhere. The most famous bit of that is that they are massively amping up their coal production, and you now have these extraordinary images coming out of central Chinese cities of almost zero visibility from smog. But at the same time, they've radically invested in they've so heavily subsidized their solar industry that German firms can't compete with them on a cost basis because they're actually charging less than the material costs for their solar panels on the market. And China has done a little bit of investment in nuclear, but nothing major. And if you kind of go back to where the Green Energy Act came from here in Ontario, it was the successor to the standard offer program. So basically, many of you might know this, but basically the Ontario government decided under McGuinty, we're getting rid of coal and we need solutions. And so they began with the standard offer program for renewable energy, and they were finding it wasn't moving fast enough. And as I understand, anyway, they went to the nuclear industry and said, we need to rethink this. We're developing a new energy policy. What can you offer us? And the economics of what they could offer were so poor that that's where the Green Energy Act came from. When you went to the renewables folks, they said, well, this is what we think we could do on the time horizons you're talking about and at these costs. And that far outperformed anything the nuclear industry is doing. And one of the other things you'll hear, which I honestly find, someone wants to tell me I've missed a trick here. I'm happy to be schooled on this. But one of the other things you'll hear is, yes, but what about next generation nuclear technology? What about what France is doing, et cetera? Well, one of the biggest French, I think the biggest French nuclear company, Arriva, I might have that wrong, is building one of the only nuclear plants currently being built in Europe, in Finland. And like every single other nuclear plant just about ever built, it is over cost, over budget, already, and not just over, like double cost that was initially estimated. And you all, if you pay power bills here in Ontario, know that you have that big global adjustment on your bill, the overwhelming majority of which is overrun costs on nuclear. Conservative party here in Ontario will tell you that it's all because of the Green Energy Act, but in fact the biggest chunk of that is from the cost of nuclear. So this is the thing, and I do follow it quite closely. My attitude has always been, I know we need to eliminate fossil fuels. If I had ever been shown that nuclear could do it faster and more effectively, I would be willing to consider it, but the cost just isn't there. And then the other piece of it is that I mean, even the cost estimates that you get aren't based on current realities. I mean, after Fukushima, the entire regulatory process for nuclear has to be rethought. And that means not really necessarily that it'll cost more, but that stretches out the time horizon for new nuclear. So, I mean, to my mind, you don't quite run an energy grid this way, but if you took $1 billion in public subsidy and handed it to renewables, different renewable technologies, and $1 billion and handed it to nuclear and said, go, and whoever gets to, whatever, 5,000 megawatts, 10,000 megawatts first, and can show that it works, that's where we're going to go. Every single renewable source would beat them there, to my mind. There are people who will try and disabuse me of that notion. Generally, I find they aren't keeping up with what the Europeans are doing on this stuff. Question back here.
Yeah, thanks for that very nice talk. Research. So you described really well what is happening in Germany, and you went back a bit to the history of where it came from. I'm actually looking for more insight about why Germany and not France, Spain,
Right.
States. And you described some of the anti-nuclear, but I still have never gotten a satisfactory answer.
Why was it Germany of all countries? Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's one that I don't think there's a definitive answer to. The first piece of it is, in fact, that they had this incredibly robust anti-nuclear and then green movement, which didn't just mean that there was activists in the streets. It meant that there were people in parliament and at state government level and at the local government level. So that was certainly a big piece of it. Second piece is that and this isn't just for Germany, because you actually do, it's not just Germany. With the exception of France, most of Western Europe has made pretty big investments in renewables. I mean, I think the actual share on the grid is larger in Portugal now than in Germany. It's mostly wind in Portugal, but they are investing in this stuff in a big way as well. All of them have very high energy prices by Canadian standards. The prices went up in the 1970s during the OPEC crisis and really never came substantially back down. So that's certainly another piece of it, is that there's that greater incentive. I think one of the things that's impossible to quantify, but I've certainly seen in my conversations with people working in German government, involved in these companies, is a real sense of national purpose around it. I think two things. One, the shock of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the long legacy of and sense of shock at what had happened in World War II have made created a population that's maybe a little bit more accepting of the idea that old ways aren't necessarily always the right ways, and so they've gotten pretty good at large-scale transition thinking, so to speak. That sounds very ethereal, but I think that's absolutely a part of it. And I was meeting with a handful of officials from the Foreign Investment and Trade Office in Berlin, and one of them sort of said, German consumers realize they are paying more. They feel that this is, their kind of contribution to solving a big problem in the world, as opposed to, obviously, having lived with the legacy of creating one of the, most horrifying acts of social engineering ever seen. So I think that's also a piece of it. Beyond that, I think part of it was just really, really smart politics. There's a certain amount of, you could almost call it luck involved. That red-green coalition, Hermann Scheer, honestly was, I think, the most important politician in the last 50 years. Certainly one of the most brilliant ones. Strategically, unbelievably smart. He saw, when everyone else was just beginning to get their head around the climate change problem, he was already meeting with legal minds in Germany to say, we need you to start writing papers in legal journals explaining why this feed-in tariff that we are eventually going to bring in is not trade protection, so that it doesn't get challenged at the European court and thrown out. It did get challenged at the European court, and it was deemed not a protectionist tariff. It was deemed as a pricing obligation, which makes it equivalent in international trade law to obliging car manufacturers to put certain things in their car if they're going to sell in your jurisdiction. In this case, you're obliging energy wholesalers to buy certain energy sources if they are going to operate in your region. But that was how far out he was thinking. The fact that he managed to do it from the backbench is extraordinary. Hermann Scheer's basically every facet of his life was pretty extraordinary. That decided he didn't want to be in cabinet because, as he put it to me, you can't do anything once you're in cabinet. Then you just have to repeat the orders of the day. You can do much more at the backbench. Certainly not true in Canadian Parliament right now. But Germans, and I would say actually that's the other piece, is the German proportional representation system of government is, to my mind, a lot more flexible and nimble on its feet than a lot of the first-past-the-post type systems where, for political reasons, people back things that are nonsensical. Our conversation in this country about carbon pricing, for example, is sub-kindergarten level at the moment. And I'm not even exaggerating. I mean, my daughter who's 8 could explain the carbon tax and why it's effective better than anyone in Parliament right now, at least in the majority and opposition benches where they shout it back and forth like a swear word. So that, I think, it's all of the above, and I think I think you can't underestimate both the elation of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and then that incredible, radical rethinking of how government works that they then had to do in the subsequent decade to somehow bring order back to a collapsed civilization, in a sense. That means you do some pretty major rethinking. And it also creates, some interesting political relationships. If you know the German Green Party, it actually goes by the name Die Grüne Bündnis 90. And Bündnis 90 is a former East German party that got absorbed into the German Green Party and helps them, help them create some of the support that got them into Parliament. And so there's a whole range of factors. But it is worth noting, it's not just Germany. I mean, Denmark has made enormous, and was started down the road the same point as Germany. They just haven't gotten as much press for it, in part because Denmark's 5 million people and Germany's the third or fourth leading export economy on earth. So the scale of it's very different. But it's not just Germany, but there are certain unique factors, I think, going on geopolitically and socially in Germany right now that play into it. Other questions over here. Mm-hmm. That is an excellent question, one I hear often. Why is there not more geothermal energy? Thermal energy is another ubiquitous power source. Some of you may know this, but just to be clear, there's several different kinds of geothermal energy. There's the most cost-effective stuff at present, which is if you're sitting on a volcano, you are sitting on a lot of geothermal energy. So Iceland and the Philippines, both of which sit on active volcanoes, do a ton of geothermal energy because it's as simple as oil drilling. You just drill down to where the heat is and use it as a fuel source. There are also both ground source and deep well geothermal that you can do anywhere. Basically, because the temperature doesn't fluctuate as much under our feet, you can use that heat differential as a power source in a myriad ways. You can certainly heat houses with it, and there are people who've done this at household scale or district scale. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah, and I think that my understanding, you might know better than me, my understanding is one of the big kind of impediments to more, certainly in Canada, doing more geothermal energy is that it's essentially a homeowner choice to pay a whole, basically it's, in a sense, do you want to buy your next 20 years of heat up front tomorrow? Over the cost of those 20 years, the savings is enormous. But, you talk to guys who work in trades, and they'll tell you, when you go in to replace somebody's furnace, and in Calgary, we've all got natural gas furnaces, most of us, you can go in there and say, your hot water heater's only got a couple of years left in it anyway. If I take them both out, install high-efficiency ones that work together really well, you're going to get your cost back in like 3, maybe 5 years. And 9 times out of 10, the homeowner will say, no, I want the cheapest one now. So it's sort of I think that part of what's going on with geothermal is a human problem. One of the other things, though, is, in a sense, no one's kind of, no one was doing large-scale mainstream solar, very few people were until the Germans came along. I mean, I think if we made it a national goal that Canada was going to lead in geothermal technology and put generous incentives in place and subsidies to the companies developing the technology and all these other sorts of things that you do, you might see. Right now, it's out of passion and interest, and it seems to be very regional too. For what my understanding is, actually, this part of Ontario, there's for whatever reason some very active geothermal companies that do it very well, and it becomes one of those word of mouth things. Hey, so and so did this, and it worked really well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. I mean, all of that technology works, and my sense is it just hasn't been incentivized properly to move from that kind of exception to the rule stage. I mean, similarly, downtown Toronto's got that deep lake cooling system, which is an incredibly innovative and really effective system that no one's duplicated for, in large part, in my experience in Canada, because the status quo is not so bad. The prices are pretty low. If there isn't that sort of outside, either pricing the carbon into the system or the flip side. And by the way, because to my mind, the Ontario government has not done a tremendously good job, and I'm being generous, communicating what its Green Energy Act is for and what it is intended to do. The initial thought behind the feed-in tariff and how it was designed and how it was built was because you were basically looking, and Scheer and Hans-Josef Fell and his colleagues in Parliament were all looking at, we've got two options for big change on the climate change front. One is to bring in some sort of direct, either punitive tax directly on polluting industries or across the board carbon tax or something like that. And that seemed like it was going to be incredibly difficult politically to bring in all on its own. Europe does have a cap and trade system, actually a common cap and trade market, which is massively underperforming. By the way, I'm going off on a tangent here, but people every now and then will say, oh no, cap and trade. The NDP, for example, federally says cap and trade is a better way to do it. All the lessons to date are that a clearer carbon price signal is given by the carbon tax. Cap and trade is a kind of a mess in implementation. Anyway, that was option one. Option two was, in a sense, to offset the cost. So why is solar worth more on the Ontario grid than power from a polluting fuel source or a conventional energy source? The idea is that bonus incentive is essentially the carbon price. It's the unburnt carbon that's been saved by bringing this renewable source on. And that was the thinking behind the feed-in tariff was, rather than punish what we don't want and get into a huge political fight with giant old guard energy companies that are going to act like the world is ending, let's just put a huge incentive in place for what we want, and eventually we'll just sort of beat them to market. And then along the way, hopefully, bring in a robust price on carbon. Now that's the piece that not a lot of jurisdictions have cracked. One of the few that has is actually British Columbia, which has demonstrated that in fact a seriously motive price on carbon is not the end of your economy, and yet still it's treated as such. And one of the other things on a side note is you can probably just make up numbers for what it would cost if you want, if your political opponent suggests it, you just say, well, that would cost $21 billion. There's no accounting there's no audit process on that number. It's just a scare number. So, yeah, I think my sense is that, to come back to it, that the geothermal has just not been incentivized the way some of the other sources have, in part because if you are looking at cost, like if you're, and conventional energy planners tend to like these simple metrics, cost per watt installed, cost per kilowatt hour, whatever. It doesn't make as much market sense, but we fix energy markets all the time, so it's just a question. And that's one of the final side notes on this tangent. There is not a single free market for any kind of electricity production or energy production at the sort of grid scale anywhere on Earth. Not one. There's the idea that renewables are being brought in with artificial subsidies that don't already exist in the system is absolute nonsense. And I can go off on that for a long time, but I won't because there are other questions. You've been waiting.
Go at wind power in Europe.
Yeah.
We're facing right now moratoriums in areas. A lot of the noise is being made about the health implications of wind power. Have you
Okay, so if you couldn't hear the question, it is, given the scale of wind energy production in Europe, are they having a similar conversation about the health impact of wind turbines, which is an extraordinary, as I know, and you all probably know as well, very, very controversial thing in Ontario. As far as I know, the single least friendly jurisdiction to wind development on Earth now seems to be rural Ontario. And I'm not really even exaggerating. There is a little bit of NIMBYism everywhere wind turbines go because they are very large and they tend to go where the wind is strongest, which tends to be undeveloped parts of the landscape or farmers' fields, places that people find them sort of intrusive. But nowhere has had this incredibly toxic conversation about so-called wind turbine syndrome as we've had in Ontario. So to kind of break that down, there is no meaningful statistical relationship ever found between health and wind turbine production. The studies that have been done in multiple jurisdictions have found that the impact is more or less equivalent, depending on your proximity to the wind farm, to living close to a highway. It's this constant low-level noise. The wind turbine syndrome as a thing was named and promulgated by a single general practitioner doctor from upstate New York who goes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, holding conferences that look like scientific conferences where she happens to be the keynote speaker. Political opponents of wind energy in Ontario latched onto this and have built it up into a thing that has caused some of these moratoria and the rest of it. Nothing has ever been shown. And all the studies have conclusively said, no, this is not the cause. That said, I think the health reports that people are personally experiencing are very likely true, but those are all symptoms of stress. They are, if your community is being torn apart by this vicious battle, neighbor to neighbor, about who got the benefit from the new wind turbines and the rest of it, you're going to be feeling stressed, you're going to not be getting very much sleep, you're going to be agitated, have headaches. All the stuff that's been reported as wind turbine syndrome is stress. I've heard it called the nocebo effect. There's been a really good report out of Australia looking at, because Australia is one of the jurisdictions where it's had this kind of fractious conversation, and there was a really good peer-reviewed study basically saying, yeah, this is the reported health impact is real. The cause has been incorrectly identified. That said, here's the glib answer to that I got from a guy who was a reeve in one of the rural municipalities in southeastern Ontario, where this was particularly mean debate. I was at a small municipalities conference a while back, and we got to talking afterward at the hotel lounge, and he said, it's the funniest thing about that wind turbine syndrome. If you have wind turbines on your property, it doesn't affect you. Only affects you if you live next to somebody who has wind turbines on their property. Which I think points to one of the leading causes, which is that the Ontario government did a terrible job of community consultation and community investment in this. This was one of the first lessons, and Herman Scheer was part of that process and told them, you need to get community involvement. You need to get ownership into the hands of the people who are going to be looking at these things all day. That is how you alleviate this NIMBY effect. And more than half of all the wind turbines in Germany, more than 70% of all the wind turbines in Denmark are owned by individuals or small collectives. So it means, it might not be your land that got the turbines are on, but you were offered the opportunity to buy into it. And so you're now looking at a thing that is not a blight on the landscape and a headache, but part of your farm revenue. There's a great example of this in Iowa. The first community-owned wind farm in Iowa is outside of a town called Jefferson, tiny little, very conservative Iowa farm town, where they, basically a handful of farmers realized, hey, you know what? This could be our retirement. We put up, eight wind turbines and form a collective to own them. And what they found, and I've spent some time in Jefferson, Iowa. And what you find is that it's not even just the people who owned it. Because the community is directly invested, because there was a whole conversation and it was in the local paper, and these entrepreneurs from our community are going to do this thing, the entire community has a sense of ownership. There's absolutely no complaint about the look of them or that's giving me headaches or whatever. It's more like this is a source of civic pride. So one of the enormous errors of the implementation of the Green Energy Act was to allow these large wind developers to basically come in, buy up leases, do absolutely abysmal community consultation, which basically amounts to, we're doing this, whatever you say, so what do you think? And then go and do it. And so now all of a sudden this community that probably had a certain amount of cohesion and a certain sense of stability is suddenly dominated by a very, very large power plant, that is now, just a, giant collection of lightning rods for people's grievances.
Your last two books, Geography of Hope and Relief, are optimistic books that point to solutions. Very positive, so is your talk. Your most recent book, The War on Science, sounds like it's really an attack. I'm not saying that it's legitimate. I'm just wondering about the change in tactics, why you're talking about the bad things going on here as opposed to, say, the good things that are really good.
Right.
What's brought you to this point of being angry about the war on science?
It's a fair question. So my most recent book, which is not the subject of this talk, is it's called The War on Science. It's basically a fairly comprehensive but brief overview of all the different ways that basic science, scientific research, and environmental stewardship are being unraveled by our current federal government. I think the thing for me was that one, I didn't feel like there was anything further to be said about some of the topics of the Geography of Hope and the Leap. I've done that research. I keep up to date on it and the rest of it, but I've made what I feel is my most compelling argument for it. And then when my focus turned back to Canada, basically the 2012 omnibus budget bill was the sort of breaking point for me. You sort of try and say, oh, we're going to focus, and my own personal activity was focused on municipal politics in Calgary. I helped form a civic engagement group called Civic Camp. One of the co-founders is now our mayor, so there was some really great stuff happening municipally in Calgary. The omnibus budget bill you just couldn't ignore. I mean, the budget bill rewrote the Fisheries Act. The budget bill rewrote the Navigable Waters Act. The budget bill closed down fisheries research stations and fisheries libraries and unraveled a whole bunch of, it was just, to my mind, the single most offensive thing any government had probably ever done was that budget bill. And then on top of that, you had this sort of emerging rancor among government scientists inside and outside government about the general disposition toward basic science. And that, to my mind, was a step outside of what I like to call my Uncle Ron parameters of debate. My Uncle Ron's my mother's brother, lovely old guy, career Army officer, very active in his community in Nova Scotia, would identify as a kind of classic, Canadian conservative of the kind of red Tory mold. And when he and I are arguing politics, and we do often, and it can get quite heated, we have recourse to the same set of facts. If he says something and I say, well, actually, Ron, you're wrong, and here's why, and there's a study that says this and this and this, he will concede the point. We've now got a government that will not concede the point. They will either eliminate or manufacture facts to suit the political argument. And that, to my mind, was sufficiently outside of the boundaries of acceptable discourse in politics that it seemed to require a response, and the opportunity was there to write a book at a time when it seemed to need the attention. I mean, there's a great book to be written about some of the stuff that's happening, on the positive side in Canadian energy and energy efficiency and the rest of it. That just wasn't the one that seemed the most timely at the moment.
So there really seems to be a lack of, whether it's policy supporting district energy, thermal energy, incentives, and we have very low natural gas prices right now, so that's not helping. And there's no carbon tax, there is another countries or jurisdiction. So I know communities that have done district energy, looking at our municipality, Calgary, but seems to be a business case.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you. So if you couldn't hear that, it was basically saying that district energy, geothermal heating, all of these sorts of things, we know they work. They work as one-offs all over the place, but there's not a lot of momentum behind them. That is one of those things. I don't know intimately what the rate setting process was for the Green Energy Act, for example, but if they wanted to put in a feed-in tariff for geothermal or district heating or any of these things, they could have. It's designed to be a flexible policy instrument. Part of the reason why it's been so successful is because, and the feed-in tariff, by the way, Ontario is not the only copycat. There are 60, maybe 70 jurisdictions worldwide have, to some degree or another, copied that original German legislation. It's designed to be, whatever you want it to be. And my sense is that and again, I don't know the process intimately. The Ontario government looked at what are the nearest to market or most desirable to bring to market technologies or energy sources to incentivize, and for whatever reason, geothermal and district heating didn't make that cut. And I would imagine it's the kind of thing that a chorus of either grassroots or industry-led voices could potentially advocate for, if not under the feed-in tariff system, under some sort of incentive system, just as as another piece of the larger puzzle. It just doesn't seem, for reasons I can't give a clear answer as to why, to be where the greatest enthusiasm is, or where the greatest successes have been at scale, anyway. Go to the back.
I just had a general question about the social aspect of Germany. Is there any concern as they expand their large-scale solar farms that there's any concern about occupying agricultural land? Is that part of the discussion at all?
The question, if you couldn't hear it, is as Germany builds large-scale solar farms, have there been questions of encroachment on agricultural land? To my knowledge, there's not been any particular hue and cry. Part of this, again, is because most of the large-scale solar farms are being built by municipalities who make are very careful about where they site them. A lot of the ground-mounted, the sort of big sort of solar field arrays, are put in marginal places, in decommissioned land, in toxic brownfield sites. All kind, there's, I think, a dozen or so really large-scale solar farms that are sitting on the footprint of old toxic lignite coal mines. So the ground was useless anyway. You could either remediate it at extraordinarily high cost and then build on it, or you, in a sense, kind of tile over it with solar panels. So they've not had that debate, I think, because they've been very smart about the way they've cited their stuff. And then the other thing is that an enormous amount of the solar in Germany is actually roof mounted, which is, in a sense, wasted space in most buildings. So there might be isolated cases, and I haven't heard of them, but as far as I know, that's been one of the remarkable pieces of that energy transition, is how little complaint there has been. Now, part of that, too, is, because a lot of the complaint about solar farms is coming from the U.S., where, and it's coming from actually conventional environmentalists for the most part, or sort of traditional environmentalists, about encroachment on it's ecologically sensitive desert and that kind of thing. Again, I think that, I don't know the intimate details, but it seems to me that you can solve that by being smarter about where you site stuff. And we tend to be a little bit blunter about it in North America. It's where's the absolute best resource? We're putting it there. That's where it's going. Where's the wind strong? That's where it's going. Where's the sun the strongest? As opposed to thinking about where is it most useful or politically expedient. That said, I will say, it's not that Germany, for example, is immune to the NIMBY argument. The Black Forest, the hills outside of Freiburg, which is the birthplace of the German Green Movement, there was a wind moratorium brought in because it was sort of decided at a regional level that it was not worth the political fight. The Black Forest having this, even though it's not pristine wilderness. If anyone's been to the Black Forest, it's got old castles in it, there are resort hotels, there's highways running through it, and the rest of it. That said, it was decided that big moving industrial wind turbines were one step too far for Germans, and the decision was basically made. It's not like you're going to make or break the energy transition by that dozen turbines or whatever, so let's just find somewhere else to put them. Right. So if you couldn't hear the question, basically there's a change in municipal, so what's it called, the municipal act? Municipal act here in Ontario, so that you as a homeowner can basically pay a small surcharge on your property tax as a way of investing in renewable energy or energy retrofits. I think it's a really, really smart way to structure that for a homeowner, because you're paying that bill every month anyway. And so if it notches up a little bit and you get benefit for that, you might be open to it. I don't know the intimate details of that, but I was just in Guelph, and I know the city of Guelph is looking very seriously at getting into that kind of a structure, and there's quite a lot of community support for it in Guelph. The most exciting one I know of that unfortunately got killed was something called PACE financing in California, and I can't remember what it's an acronym, and I can't remember exactly what it's for, but it's very, very similar. What PACE financing was going to be was basically a municipal bond that you would get to put solar on your, it was mainly solar, I think, in California, and then you would pay it back through your property taxes. And there was, I can't remember exactly how many, but dozens of California municipalities got into it, and they had begun to sign up. They were all oversubscribed within days. People loved it. It was going like gangbusters, and we're talking about 2007, 2008, and then the collapse of the U.S. economy, particularly the bursting of the housing bubble. The big mortgage lenders, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, said, no, that PACE financing is a lien on a mortgage. We're not allowing any new kinds of lien right now. We just nearly, collapsed entirely. So that scares us. We're now risk averse to the extreme, and so a really good idea got thrown out with, the junk mortgage stuff that caused the actual collapse. So, and I've heard recently, but I haven't had a chance to look at it, that they're amping that back up. I think for commercial properties, though, interestingly enough, not for households. But it strikes me as a really nimble and easy way to do that sort of thing, because it does get past the fact that most renewable technologies, it gets back to that technologic, as Herman Scheer liked to call it. The thing about renewables is the cost is all upfront. And we as homeowners or renters or property managers or whatever don't like high upfront cost. And so is there a way to, and yes, you can do it bank by bank, loan by loan, but if you can make it really, really simple, I mean, if it's almost a box you tick on your municipal property tax bill or something, sign up here and it'll happen. If we really wanted to see it, I think that would be, one of the great ways to go.
Actually, Halifax has done something.
Have they?
To support that solar thermal panels on residential homes. So it's not called low charges, but it's a similar program.
Right. Yeah, my understanding is Nova Scotia generally has seen the light on this stuff, and that's actually one of the. To come back to your point about the unoptimistic book, at lower levels of government, we're actually seeing some really great stuff on this front. Stuff that I wasn't even aware of. One of the other ones that I recently heard about, going back to the smart grid stuff, is that NB Power, New Brunswick's power company, is now Siemens' lead global partner on smart grid development. And the reason for that, as it was put to me, I was speaking in New Brunswick recently, and someone from Siemens came up afterward and said, do you know about this? And I didn't, so I need to go back and learn about it. But the way it was described to me was that, just as it's kind of a curious story, NB Power almost got bought out by Quebec Hydro. And apparently as a company, this was, as one of the people put it to me, it was a near-death experience for them. And they came out uniquely open to new ideas and new ways of thinking about their business, wound up getting into some of the early smart grid testing, and for a variety of reasons in terms of the way New Brunswick's power grid operates and the way it's balanced and the rest of it, it's uniquely good at hosting smart grid technology. So you can go province to province. You can city of Calgary, where I live. This is not bragged about for reasons and I've asked the mayor, why don't you guys ever talk about this? And no, it's just not something we talk about. City of Calgary as a municipal corporation has a net zero footprint. They developed they did it under the former mayor, Dave Bronconier, who was basically hitting Kyoto targets without ever saying that's what he was doing. Because to say so would have been politically difficult in Calgary, to say you were subscribing to Kyoto. But basically commissioned a bunch of wind, some solar, some district heating, a few other things. And initially it was just the sea trains, the light rail system. Light rail system, it was called Ride the Wind. It basically built enough wind to, it's not that they directly connected the sea train to the wind turbines, but that was the size of the installations, and then that was so painless and helpful to on a bunch of fronts that they decided, let's just do that for our entire municipal corporate footprint. And they don't coerce on it, they don't brag about it, but City of Calgary has zero. I particularly like saying that to Vancouver audiences, because for whatever reason, Vancouver audiences really want to tell me a thing or two about Calgary, and that's my response. No offense if anyone's from Vancouver. It's a regional rivalry thing. It's it's like Toronto versus everyone else. It's that kind of. Any other questions? How much time have we got here?
I think there was a glass there. Yeah, there is.
Okay, so why don't we, final question. Who's most burning final? Anyone? Anywhere? All right.
Do Greens in Canada have something to learn from Greens in Europe still? And if so, what is it? What would you say are the most important things that we need to learn from Europe?
Are we talking about the political party, or are we talking about? As many of you heard off the top, I ran for the Green Party in the Calgary Centre by-election last fall. It was a hell of an experience. One of those things, while we're on the civic pride angle, that not a lot of people thought that a guy running for the Green Party in downtown Calgary could get 26% of the vote, but we did, and seriously challenged for the race. I think there's a ton to learn. The tricky thing is, at this point, one of them is I guess kind of strategic, in the sense that one of the things Greens have done really well in Germany is, and some of their other partners, is talk about a positive vision worth building, as opposed to merely talking about what doesn't work and what is bad. And one of the reasons why I find things like the conversation about the oil sands and pipelines here in Canada problematic is because it has turned into such a kind of a lightning rod for a whole bunch of old divisive conversations about who's right and who's wrong and left and right and the rest of it. And I really don't think that as a country it does us any good to rehash all those old grievances, since we have to be working toward a common goal anyway, even if there are some of these. And so, maybe, I think we have to remain open as a card-carrying former Green candidate, open to the possibility that Canada's sustainable energy future still has some new pipelines left in it. That might be part of what that future needs to look like. The thing that we haven't done is even begin to talk about what our national goal is. Even, I mean. There's no metric to hold it up against. Do we need this for that thing we're working toward? There's no thing we're working toward, which is the problem. So that's the one. The other great lesson is, in addition to the fact that simply, like the Heinrich Böll Institute, which is the German Green Party. One of the neat things about federal parties in Germany is they all get federal money to set up research institutes. So every single official party has its own research institute, and the German Green Party's institute has done some fantastic research on, everything from democratic reform to green energy to, just across the board. So it's a great resource that way. The other lesson, obviously, is that there's a strong case to be made that proportional representation is a better representation of a nation's values. The shorthand for this, for those of you who don't keep up with proportional representation debates, is if you don't like the idea of proportional representation, you talk about Italy. And if you do like the idea of proportional representation, you talk about Germany, because it's actually been a really effective system, and most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, but like the way the German system works, when you vote in a federal election, you vote for both a candidate and a party. And so there are a certain number of seats in the Bundestag elected by direct vote. So you voted for that guy who is the representation for your region, and then a whole other huge chunk of the parliament is divided among all the parties with official status. So the Greens, for example, before they ever directly elected anyone, got over the 5% threshold and got a little piece, whatever it was, 7, 8 of the seats, which allowed them to have a voice and be taken seriously. If we had proportional representation in Canada, I think the Greens would have 13 seats now. And a number of others would, and part of the reason we don't have it is because it would hurt all of the traditional parties who are deeply invested in fighting over that first past the post, and have basically, their entire institutional memory is of how to strategize around that particular battle. So that's on a bad note to end it on. That would be, one of many very ambitious things we could be doing in Canada is rethinking our electoral system. Small goals. And so in any case, I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon. As I said off the top, I welcome your comments. If you want to come and grab one of my cards and want to be in touch about challenges you're running into in your community or in your workplace, I'm happy to carry on this conversation after we leave. And again, thank you all very much for your time. I appreciate it.